The mysterious girl at the laundromat. In the stillness of Bridgeton's nights, the fluorescent hum of the town's 24-hour laundromat stood out as an unassuming sentinel of activity. Most residents were fast asleep, their curtains drawn and their homes silent under the soft glow of the moon. Sheriff Mark Reynolds, a man accustomed to the eerie tranquility of the night shift, sipped on his coffee while parked in his patrol car near Main Street. The aroma of bitter, overbrewed coffee mixed with the faint scent of damp grass through the slightly cracked window. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes scanning the street out of habit. Mark was a man marked by loss. His wife, Rachel, and their son, Ethan, had been taken from him in a tragic car accident 5 years prior. Since then, Mark had immersed himself in work, seeking solace in the predictable monotony of his nightly patrols. The streets of Bridgeton, with their low crime rates and familiar faces, had become both his haven and his prison. It was on one such uneventful night that something unusual caught his attention. As he drove past the laundromat, his headlights illuminated a lone figure entering the building. Mark squinted, slowing his car to a crawl. A young girl, no older than 10, carried a large, worn-out backpack into the laundromat. Her small frame was dwarfed by the oversized hoodie she wore, and her steps were cautious, almost mechanical. Mark's brow furrowed. A child at this hour. Alone. The laundromat wasn't the sort of place where kids wandered after dark. His instincts, honed by years of experience, whispered that something wasn't right. He pulled over across the street and watched as the girl settled inside. Through the large glass windows, he could see her meticulously unloading a bundle of clothes into a washing machine. Her movements were deliberate, as if she had done this countless times before. Mark's first thought was to approach her immediately, but he hesitated. Perhaps her parents were nearby, or maybe she was simply helping out with chores. He decided to observe for now, hoping to see an adult join her. Minutes turned into an hour, but no one came. The laundromat remained eerily quiet, with only the rhythmic hum of machines filling the air. The next night, the same scene played out, and the night after that. Each time, Mark saw the girl arrive at the laundromat alone, her routine unchanging. She would sort the clothes with care, load the machines, and sit quietly on a bench, her gaze distant, and her posture tense. By the fourth night, Mark's curiosity had grown into concern. He decided it was time to investigate. He parked his patrol car closer to the laundromat and waited for her arrival. When she appeared, emerging from the shadows like a ghost, he felt a pang of unease. Her movements were cautious, her head darting left and right, as if she were checking for potential threats. Mark watched as she disappeared inside and then followed. The familiar chime of the laundromat's doorbell rang out as he stepped into the brightly lit interior. The girl froze mid-step, her wide eyes meeting his. She clutched her backpack tighter, her small fingers gripping the straps with white-knuckled intensity. "Hi there," Mark said softly, keeping his tone non-threatening. "I'm Sheriff Reynolds. What's your name?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she took a step back, her expression guarded. Mark noticed the scuff marks on her sneakers, the frayed edges of her jeans, and the way her hoodie seemed to swallow her whole. "It's okay," he continued. "I'm not here to get you in trouble. I just want to make sure you are safe." Still, she said nothing. Her eyes darted to the door, and Mark instinctively stepped to the side, giving her space but silently blocking her exit. He didn't want her to feel trapped, but he also couldn't let her leave without understanding what was going on. After a few tense moments, the girl finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Amira." "Amira," Mark repeated, nodding. "That's a beautiful name. Are you here by yourself?" Amira hesitated, then nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently. Amira's lips trembled, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and began sorting clothes, her small hands moving mechanically as if to distract herself. Mark noticed the tightness in her shoulders, the way she avoided his gaze. "Amira, I'm here to help," he said softly. but I need to understand what's going on. Are you in trouble?" Her hands froze mid-motion, and for a brief moment Mark thought she might open up. But then she shook her head and muttered, "I'm fine." It was a lie, and Mark knew it. He could see the cracks in her facade, the weariness in her every movement. He decided not to press her further that night. Instead, he left his card on the bench beside her. "If you ever need anything, call me," he said before leaving the laundromat. That night, as Mark sat in his patrol car, watching Amira through the laundromat's windows, he felt a deep sense of unease. There was more to her story, of that he was certain. But what haunted him most was the loneliness he saw in her eyes. It was a look he recognized all too well, one that mirrored his own. Mark made a silent promise to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of purpose, a chance to make a difference. Little did he know, the journey ahead would test him in ways he could never have imagined and uncover secrets that would forever change both their lives. A deeper mystery. Mark couldn't shake the image of Amira from his mind. That night, as he sat in the dim glow of his office, he stared at the untouched paperwork on his desk. His mind churned with questions. Who was Amira? Why was she alone at the laundromat every night? And why did she seem so reluctant to talk? He decided to take a more measured approach. Jumping to conclusions wouldn't help anyone, least of all Amira. Instead, Mark began piecing together what little he knew. He opened his laptop and began searching local records, school rosters, community registries, and even recent police reports revealed no trace of a child named Amira. It was as if she didn't exist. Frustration gnawed at him. Bridgeton was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. A child living off the radar was almost unheard of. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. He knew he couldn't solve this mystery from behind a desk. He needed to see where Amira went when she left the laundromat. The following night, Mark arrived at the laundromat earlier than usual, parking his car a block away to avoid drawing attention. He waited, his eyes fixed on the street. Just before midnight, Amira appeared. She emerged from the shadows of an alley, her small figure illuminated by the flickering streetlight. As she entered the laundromat, Mark slipped out of his car and positioned himself in the alley where she'd come from. The alley was narrow, lined with dumpsters and overgrown with weeds. At the far end, Mark spotted a rusted fire escape leading up to an abandoned apartment building. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling from the walls. It didn't look like a place anyone would willingly stay, let alone a child. Mark's heart sank as he examined the area. This must be where she was living. The thought of Amira spending her nights in such a desolate place filled him with a mix of anger and sorrow. How had no one noticed? How had this child slipped through the cracks? Determined to get a closer look, Mark climbed the fire escape, his boots scraping against the rusted metal. He stopped at the second floor, where the boards over one of the windows had been pried loose. Peering inside, he saw a small makeshift space. The thin blanket lay spread out on the floor, along with a few tattered belongings. A stuffed animal missing an ear, a flashlight with fading batteries, and a small stack of books. Mark's chest tightened. This was all she had. No bed, no warmth, no safety, just the bare minimum to survive. He climbed back down, his resolve hardening. Amira's situation wasn't just concerning, it was unacceptable. He needed to do something, but he had to tread carefully. The last thing he wanted was to scare her into running. The next morning, Mark decided to speak with some of the locals. He visited the diner where the night staff often saw the comings and goings of Bridgeton. Pulling up a stool at the counter, he ordered a coffee and struck up a conversation with Leela, the waitress who'd worked the night shift for years. "Have you noticed a little girl hanging around the laundromat at night?" Mark asked casually, sipping his coffee. Leela raised an eyebrow. "You mean that quiet kid?" "Yeah, I've seen her a few times. She doesn't bother anyone. But it's odd seeing the kid out so late. She always looks so lost." Does she ever come in here? Mark pressed. Leela shook her head. Not that I've seen. She just goes straight to the laundromat and stays there for hours. Honestly, Sheriff, I figured she had someone waiting for her. You think she's in trouble? Mark hesitated before replying. I don't know yet. I'm trying to find out. That evening, Mark returned to the laundromat. This time, he brought food, 2 sandwiches, and a thermos of hot cocoa. When Amira arrived, he waited for her to settle in before approaching. She was seated on the bench, her backpack beside her, as she watched the washing machine spin. Hey, Amira, Mark said softly as he entered. He held up the bag of food. Thought you might be hungry. Amira's eyes widened, and she glanced at the door as if considering an escape. But she didn't move. Mark set the bag on the bench beside her and sat down a few feet away, giving her space. I just want to talk, he said. No pressure. Amira hesitated, then cautiously opened the bag. The smell of fresh sandwiches filled the air, and her stomach growled audibly. She glanced at Mark, her expression a mix of suspicion and gratitude, before taking a small bite. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. You're welcome, Mark replied. He watched as she ate, her small hands clutching the sandwich as if afraid it might be taken away. After a moment he asked, Amira, where are you staying? She froze, her eyes darting to him. Why? Because I want to help, Mark said gently. You shouldn't have to do this alone. Amira looked down at her sandwich, her fingers tightening around it. I'm fine, she muttered. Living in that old building isn't fine, Mark said softly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. How do you know? I saw your space, Mark admitted. I'm sorry if that feels like an invasion, but I needed to understand what's going on. Amira, you don't have to live like this. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly looked away. You don't understand, she whispered. If they find me, they'll send me back. Mark's heart sank. Back where? To foster care, she said, her voice trembling. Or worse. I can't go back. I won't. Mark's mind raced. He hadn't expected this. Foster care. Worse. What had this child been through? He reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Amira, he said softly, no one is going to hurt you, I promise. But I need to know more to help you. Can you tell me what happened? For a long moment, Amira didn't respond. Then, finally, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. But not here. Mark nodded, understanding. We'll go somewhere safe. As they left the laundromat together, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. He didn't know where the road would lead, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let Amira face it alone. The past unfolds. Mark pulled his patrol car into a quiet corner of Bridgeton Park, a secluded spot where the trees muffled the noise of the world and the moonlight filtered softly through their branches. Amira sat in the passenger seat, her backpack clutched tightly to her chest. She hadn't said much since they'd left the laundromat, and Mark respected her silence, sensing that she needed time to gather her thoughts. He turned off the engine and faced her. No one will bother us here, he said gently. Take your time. Amira glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the dark park before finally settling on the dashboard. She didn't look at Mark as she spoke, her voice low and steady, as though the weight of her words might shatter her if she let herself feel too much. My mom was the only person I had, she began. It was just the two of us for as long as I can remember. We moved around a lot. Cheap apartments, shelters, sometimes even a friend's couch for a few nights. Mom always said things would get better, that we just needed to hold on a little longer. Mark nodded, his chest tightening as he imagined the hardships they must have endured. He stayed quiet, letting her continue. She worked hard, 2, sometimes 3 jobs. Cleaning houses, waiting tables, even babysitting when she could find the work. But it was never enough. Rent kept going up, and then she got sick. Amira paused, her small hands gripping her backpack so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Mark could see her breathing quicken, but she pushed on. She tried to hide it at first, she said, her voice shaking. Told me it was just a cold. But then the coughing got worse, and she couldn't get out of bed some days. I tried to help. I'd cook, clean, whatever I could. But I was just a kid. And when she couldn't work anymore, we lost the apartment. Mark's throat tightened as he listened. He knew the system well enough to understand how easily people like Amira's mother could fall through the cracks, how quickly circumstances could spiral beyond control. What happened then? He asked softly. Amira's eyes glistened, but she blinked away the tears. We ended up in a shelter for a while. It wasn't so bad. At first. They had beds, and Mom said it was only temporary. But then they told her she needed to see a doctor, and she refused. She said if they knew how sick she really was, they'd take me away. Mark felt his chest ache at the thought of Amira's mother, desperately clinging to her child even as her own health failed. And then, he prompted gently. Amira took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper now. One day, she couldn't get out of bed at all. She told me to stay home from school, said she just needed rest. I stayed with her, but she didn't wake up the next morning. Mark closed his eyes briefly, the pain in her voice cutting through him like a blade. He could see it so clearly, a little girl sitting alone, waiting for her mother to wake up, realizing she never would. I didn't know what to do, Amira continued. I was scared. I thought if I told someone, they'd put me in foster care, and I'd never see her again. So I just left. I packed a bag and ran. Mark swallowed hard, struggling to keep his emotions in check. How long have you been on your own, Amira? She shrugged, her eyes fixed on her lap. A few months, maybe. I lost track. And the laundromat? He asked. Why there? It's warm, she said simply. And it's quiet. Nobody bothers me. Mark leaned back in his seat, his heart heavy with the weight of her story. This small, brave child had been navigating a world no child should ever have to face, surviving on her own in the shadows of a town that had failed to notice her struggle. After a long silence, Mark spoke. Amira, you've been through so much. More than anyone should ever have to. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. There are people who want to help you, who care about you. Amira looked up at him then, her eyes wary but searching. How do I know I can trust you? She asked. It was a fair question, and Mark didn't blame her for asking it. I can't make you trust me, he said honestly, but I can show you. Let me prove to you that I'm here to help. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're safe. Amira studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said quietly. Mark felt a surge of relief, but he knew this was only the beginning. Amira's trust was fragile, and he would have to earn it step by step. But for now, she had taken the first step, a step towards a better future. The next morning, Mark made arrangements to get Amira the help she needed. He contacted social services, explaining the situation and emphasizing the urgency of her case. He also reached out to a local nonprofit organization that provided support for children in crisis, ensuring that Amira would have access to food, clothing, and a safe place to stay. But Mark knew that wasn't enough. Amira needed more than just temporary assistance. She needed stability, a home, and someone who would fight for her. And as he looked at her sitting quietly in his office, her small frame dwarfed by the chair, he realized that he wanted to be that someone. Amira, he said gently, kneeling in front of her. Would you be okay with staying with me for a while? Just until we figure everything out. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she hesitated before nodding slowly. You'd really let me stay? Of course, Mark said. As long as you're okay with it. My home isn't fancy, but it's warm and safe, and you'll always have a place there. Amira's lips trembled, and for the first time, a tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, nodding again. Thank you, she whispered. Mark smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of sadness and hope. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that together they could face whatever challenges came their way. For the first time in years, Mark felt a sense of purpose, a chance to make a difference, not just as a sheriff, but as a man determined to give a lost child the home and love she deserved. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Building a new life. The morning sun cast a warm glow through the blinds of Mark's living room, illuminating a space that had long been defined by silence and solitude. For years, the house had felt more like a monument to grief than a home, its empty rooms echoing with memories of a family Mark had lost. But now, something had shifted. Sitting at the kitchen table, her small hands wrapped around a steaming mug of hot cocoa, was Amira. Mark watched her from the doorway, a hesitant smile tugging at his lips. She seemed smaller in the light of day, her oversized hoodie hanging loosely on her frame. Her eyes, though still shadowed by worry, flickered with curiosity as she took in her surroundings. "Is it okay?" Mark asked, nodding toward the cocoa. Amira looked up, startled by the question. She gave a quick nod and murmured, "It's good. Thank you." Mark stepped into the kitchen and sat across from her. He'd spent the early hours preparing for this moment, wanting to make her first morning in his home feel welcoming. The smell of pancakes and bacon lingered in the air, and the table was set with an assortment of breakfast foods. It wasn't much, but he hoped it would make her feel safe. As Amira nibbled on a slice of toast, Mark leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "Amira, I want you to know something," he began. "This is your home now, for as long as you need it. You don't have to worry about anything. I'm here for you." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked softly. The question caught Mark off guard, but he answered without hesitation. "Because everyone deserves a place where they feel safe and cared for. And because I care about you, Amira." Her gaze dropped to her plate, and for a moment, Mark thought she might dismiss his words. But then she whispered, "No one's ever said that to me before." Mark felt his heart clench. He wanted to say more, to reassure her that she was no longer alone, but he knew words could only go so far. Instead, he reached across the table and gave her hand a gentle squeeze. She didn't pull away, and that small gesture filled him with hope. Over the next few days, Mark worked tirelessly to integrate Amira into his life. He took her shopping for clothes, letting her pick out anything she wanted. At first, she hesitated, her instinct to avoid being a burden holding her back. But with gentle encouragement, she began to open up, her shy smiles growing more frequent as she browsed through racks of brightly colored shirts and jeans. At the grocery store, Mark learned that Amira had a sweet tooth. Her eyes lit up when she spotted a display of chocolate chip cookies, and Mark couldn't resist adding a pack to their cart. "You've got good taste," he joked, earning a small giggle from her. Back at home, Mark showed her to the spare bedroom he'd hastily cleaned and furnished. It wasn't much, a bed, a dresser, and a small desk, but he'd added a few touches to make it feel welcoming. A soft pink blanket lay folded at the foot of the bed, and a stuffed teddy bear sat on the pillow. "This is your space," Mark said, standing in the doorway as Amira stepped inside. "You can decorate it however you like. If there's anything you need, just let me know." Amira turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's all for me." "Every bit of it," Mark replied with a smile. She didn't say anything, but the way she clutched the teddy bear to her chest spoke volumes. As the days turned into weeks, Amira began to settle into her new life. The guarded walls she built around herself slowly started to crumble, revealing glimpses of the bright, curious child beneath. She asked questions about shadows from the past. Amira's laughter echoed through the kitchen as Mark flipped another pancake high into the air. It landed perfectly in the skillet, prompting her to clap her hands with delight. The morning routine had become a cherished tradition, a moment of joy and connection that set the tone for their day. "You're getting better at that," Amira teased, a mischievous smile spreading across her face. "Well, I've had a good teacher," Mark replied, grinning as he slid the pancake onto her plate. It was moments like these that made the weight of the world feel lighter, but Mark knew their peaceful life was precarious. There were still unanswered questions about Amira's past, and the systems in place to protect her could be both a blessing and a curse. Later that day, Mark received an unexpected call from Monica Dawson. Her voice was calm, but there was an undertone of urgency it put Mark on edge. "Sheriff, we need to talk," she said. "Something's come up regarding Amira's case." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "I'll explain when I get there," Monica replied. "I'm on my way now." Mark hung up and looked over at Amira, who was sprawled on the living room floor, sketching a picture of a butterfly with her new colored pencils. He forced a smile. "Hey, kiddo, Monica's coming over. She probably just wants to check in." Amira glanced up, her brow furrowing slightly. "Am I in trouble?" "Not at all," Mark assured her. "You're doing great. Monica just likes to make sure everything's going smoothly." Amira nodded and returned to her drawing, but Mark could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. It mirrored his own. When Monica arrived, she asked to speak with Mark privately. They stepped out onto the porch, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his tone tense. Monica took a deep breath. "We've been reviewing Amira's file, and some discrepancies have come to light. It seems her mother had a pending immigration case at the time of her death. Because of this, Amira's legal status is complicated." Mark felt his stomach drop. "Complicated how?" "She's technically undocumented," Monica explained. "Her mother's case was never resolved, which leaves Amira in a sort of legal limbo. Normally, this wouldn't be an issue if she were in the foster care system, but given that you've taken her in, it adds a layer of complexity." Mark's jaw tightened. "What does this mean for her future?" Monica hesitated. "It means there's a risk that Amira could face deportation unless her status is resolved. I don't want to alarm you, but we need to act quickly to ensure her safety." Mark's heart pounded as he absorbed the news. The thought of Amira being torn away from the life they were building was unbearable. "What can we do?" he asked. Monica's expression softened. "There are legal pathways we can pursue, but they'll take time and resources. In the meantime, you'll need to document everything: her progress, her integration into your home, and the stability you're providing. It's going to be a lot of work, but I know you're up to the task." Mark nodded firmly. "I'll do whatever it takes." That evening, Mark sat down with Amira to explain the situation in the simplest terms he could. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he also believed she deserved honesty. "Monica told me we have some paperwork to sort out," he said gently. "It's nothing to worry about, but we need to make sure everything is in order so you can stay here with me." Amira's eyes widened. "Stay with you?" "Of course," Mark said, reaching for her hand. "You're part of my family now. We're not going to let anything change that." Her lips trembled, and tears welled up in her eyes. "You promise?" "I promise," Mark said, his voice steady. "But I'm going to need your help. We have to work together to show everyone how strong and brave you are." Amira nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. "Okay, I'll do my best." Over the next few weeks, their lives became a whirlwind of appointments, meetings, and legal proceedings. Monica connected them with an immigration attorney who specialized in cases like Amira's, and Mark began compiling every piece of evidence he could to support her case. He gathered school enrollment records, letters from neighbors who had seen Amira thrive under his care, and even her drawings, which he believed captured her journey of healing and growth. Each night, after Amira had gone to bed, Mark pored over the documents, determined to leave no stone unturned. But the process wasn't without its challenges. One afternoon, as Mark picked Amira up from her new school, he noticed her sitting alone on a bench, her head bowed, and her shoulders slumped. When she got into the car, her usual chatter was replaced by silence. "What's wrong, kiddo?" Mark asked gently. Amira hesitated, then mumbled, "Some kid said I don't belong here. That I'm not really American." Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He took a deep breath, steadying his emotions before replying. "Listen to me, Amira. You belong here as much as anyone else. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. You're brave, smart, and kind, qualities that have nothing to do with where you were born." Amira nodded, but her eyes remained downcast. Mark knew it would take more than words to undo the damage those thoughtless remarks had caused. He resolved to do everything in his power to shield her from the harsh realities of a world that often seemed intent on tearing people down. One evening, as Mark was reviewing Amira's case files, he came across a letter tucked into a folder Monica had given him. It was from Amira's mother, written shortly before her death. The words were a mix of hope and desperation, a mother's plea for her child to have a better future. "To whoever finds this," the letter began, "please take care of my daughter. She is my everything. I have tried so hard to give her a good life, but I fear I may not succeed. She is kind, intelligent, and stronger than she knows. Please don't let her dreams die with me." Mark set the letter down, his hands trembling. The weight of Amira's mother's love and sacrifice was overwhelming, and it only deepened his resolve to fight for her. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a special drawer in his desk, a reminder of the promise he'd made to Amira, to her mother, and to himself. As the days turned into weeks, Mark and Amira faced each new challenge together. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were no longer walking it alone. Together, they were building a life defined not by the shadows of the past, but by the promise of a brighter future. The brightest future. The courtroom was silent except for the faint rustling of papers and the occasional creak of a chair. Mark sat at the table next to Amira, his heart pounding as the judge flipped through the thick file of documents they had compiled. Amira's small hand was clasped tightly in his own, a silent reassurance that they would face whatever came next together. For weeks, they had worked tirelessly to prepare for this moment. Mark had spent countless late nights poring over forms, gathering character references, and documenting every detail of Amira's progress since she had come to live with him. Their attorney, Ms. Patel, had been a fierce advocate, guiding them through the complexities of immigration law and family court. But now, as they sat before the judge, the weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said, looking over his glasses, "you've presented a compelling case for guardianship, as well as for Amira's petition to remain in the United States. However, this is an unusual situation. You are not related to Amira by blood, and her legal status complicates matters." Mark's stomach churned, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room, "I may not be related to Amira by blood, but I can assure you that she is family to me. She's been through more than any child should ever have to face, and all she wants is a chance to feel safe, to belong. I'm asking you to give her that chance." The judge studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Amira. "Miss Amira, is there anything you'd like to say?" Amira hesitated, her eyes darting to Mark for reassurance. He gave her a small nod, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "I just want to stay with Sheriff Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "He makes me feel safe. He takes care of me. And he makes me pancakes on Saturdays." A soft chuckle rippled through the courtroom, and even the judge's stern expression softened slightly. Amira continued, her voice growing steadier. "My mom always said we came to America for a better life. She wanted me to go to school and have a future. I think she'd be happy if I stayed with Sheriff Mark because he feels like home." Mark blinked back tears, his chest swelling with pride. He squeezed Amira's hand, silently thanking her for her bravery. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "This is a complicated case," he said finally, But what I see here is a child who has found stability and care in an otherwise difficult situation. And I see a man who has gone above and beyond to provide her with the love and support she needs." He paused, the room holding its collective breath. "I'm granting Mr. Reynolds temporary guardianship of Amira while her immigration case is processed. I'm also approving her petition to remain in the United States under special immigrant juvenile status. This is not a permanent solution, but it's a step in the right direction." Relief flooded through Mark as the words sank in. He looked down at Amira, who was staring up at the judge with wide eyes. "Does that mean I get to stay?" she whispered. "It does," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're staying, kiddo." The courtroom erupted in quiet applause as the judge banged his gavel. Amira threw her arms around Mark, and for the first time, he let himself believe that everything was going to be okay. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Amira's case had been a victory, but there was still work to be done. The road ahead was long, with more hearings and evaluations to secure permanent guardianship and eventually adoption. But for now, they had something they hadn't had before: hope. Mark celebrated the win in small but meaningful ways. He took Amira to her favorite diner, where she devoured a plate of waffles with whipped cream and strawberries. They visited the park, where she squealed with delight as she raced him to the swings. And one evening, he surprised her with a new sketch pad and a set of watercolor paints. "For my favorite artist," he said, handing her the gift. Amira's face lit up, and she threw her arms around him. "Thank you, Mark. You're the best." "No, you're the best," he replied, ruffling her hair. As the weeks turned into months, Amira continued to thrive. She made friends at school, joined the art club, and even participated in a local talent show, where she proudly displayed one of her paintings. Mark watched from the audience, his heart bursting with pride as she received a standing ovation. But it wasn't just Amira who was changing. Mark found himself opening up in ways he hadn't thought possible. He reconnected with old friends, started volunteering in the community, and even began attending a support group for grieving parents. Amira had given him a purpose, a reason to heal, and he was determined to be the best version of himself for her. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Amira turned to Mark and said, "Do you think my mom knows I'm okay?" Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with warmth. "I think she does," he said, "and I think she's incredibly proud of you." Amira smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I think she'd like you." Mark felt his throat tighten, but he managed a soft chuckle. "I hope so." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey finally giving way to a sense of peace. For the first time in years, Mark's house felt like a home again, a place filled with laughter, love, and the promise of a brighter future. And as he looked down at Amira, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, he knew one thing for certain: they had found their way to each other, and together they could face anything. The end of one journey, the start of another. The stars above Bridgeton twinkled faintly as Mark carried Amira to her room. She had fallen asleep on the porch, her breathing steady and her face peaceful in a way he had rarely seen before. Carefully, he tucked her into bed, pulling the butterfly blanket snugly around her. For a moment, he simply watched her sleep, marveling at the resilience of the small girl who had already changed his life in so many ways. The following morning, the phone rang as Mark poured himself a cup of coffee. It was Monica Dawson. Her tone was upbeat, and Mark braced himself for what she might say. "Sheriff Reynolds, I have some good news," Monica said. "The court has expedited Amira's adoption process. Given your spotless record and the significant progress she's made in your care, the judge is willing to grant permanent guardianship if you're still interested in adopting her." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Interested?" he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Monica, I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "That's what I was hoping to hear," Monica replied with a smile in her voice. "I'll schedule a final court date for next month. It's mostly a formality at this point, but we'll need you both there." Mark hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly as he processed the news. This was it, the chance to make their little family official. A smile spread across his face as he thought about how to tell Amira. That evening after dinner, Mark sat Amira down in the living room. She tilted her head curiously, sensing his excitement. "What's going on?" she asked, clutching her stuffed teddy bear. Mark took a deep breath, then smiled. "I have some big news. Monica called today, and she told me the court is ready to finalize something very important." Amira's eyes widened. "What is it?" Mark leaned forward, his voice soft but steady. "Amira, I want to adopt you. I want to make it official that you're my daughter, but only if that's something you want too." For a moment, Amira didn't move. Then, tears welled up in her eyes, and she flung herself into Mark's arms. "Really?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You really want me?" "More than anything," Mark said, holding her tightly. "You've made my life so much brighter, Amira. I can't imagine it without you." Amira buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with emotion. "I want that too," she said between sobs. "I want to stay with you forever." The final court hearing was a quiet, emotional affair. Amira sat next to Mark, holding his hand tightly as the judge reviewed the case one last time. Monica, their attorney Ms. Patel, and a few supportive neighbors were present, all of them eager to witness the culmination of a journey that had brought so much healing to both Mark and Amira. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said, his tone warm, "I've read through your file and seen the incredible progress Amira has made under your care. It's clear to me that she has found not only a guardian but a father. I'm pleased to grant this adoption and officially recognize Amira Reynolds as your daughter." A wave of applause filled the courtroom as Mark pulled Amira into a tight hug. "We did it, kiddo," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're a family." Amira clung to him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." In the days that followed, their lives settled into a new rhythm. Amira's confidence continued to grow, her laughter filling the house in a way that made it feel alive again. Mark found himself smiling more, his heart lighter than it had been in years. On a sunny Saturday morning, as they made pancakes together in the kitchen, Amira looked up at Mark with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Mom knows about this?" she asked, her voice tentative. Mark set down the spatula and crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. "I think your mom is watching over you, Amira," he said gently. "And I think she's incredibly proud of you, of us." Amira smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I think so too." They finished breakfast together, their bond stronger than ever. As they sat at the table, Amira reached across and took Mark's hand. "I love you, Dad," she said softly. Mark's throat tightened, and he squeezed her hand in return. "I love you too, sweetheart." That night, as Mark tucked Amira into bed, he felt a deep sense of peace. The house, once filled with silence and grief, now overflowed with love and laughter. And as he turned off the light and closed her door, he knew they had found something truly extraordinary. A second chance at family, a brighter future built on hope and resilience. Together, they had transformed their pain into something beautiful, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, love could light the way home.